struggling with the link.
Oh, sorry.
That's my fault. I just couldn't get into it. So I've been fooling around for the last several minutes. So my apologies.
Oh, no worries. I just introduced myself and just said we had to wait for a few seconds for people to come in anyway. So we've done that. And so let me just continue. As I said,
Good.
Welcome to everybody for this discussion with the Honorable Kevin Rudd on the topic, Can China and the US Coexist Productively? And this is based on his new book, The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. Now, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, Kevin Rudd is president and CEO of the Asia Society and president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York City. But even more notably, he's also been Australia's 26th prime minister from 2007 to 2010, then as foreign minister from 2010 to 2012, before returning again as prime minister in 2013. But in addition to all of these impressive political and policy-making credentials, he's also a very serious student of Chinese history, politics, and culture. He speaks Mandarin very well. He has had many conversations with senior Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping for something like, 10 hours or so over several different occasions, and many other Chinese leaders, both civilian and military, as well, of course, as US leaders. So he has both scholarly and hands-on experience, an excellent basis for the book that he's written. So welcome, Kevin, if I may. Great to have you here. We've interacted, I know, on a couple of occasions. I've never really had the chance to discuss China with you, so I'm really happy to have this opportunity. So, but let's get right into it. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm looking forward to it, and thank you very much for having me in this particular gathering. And I'm looking forward to the conversation. China is the topic near the top of everyone's minds, not just in the United States, but around the world, for a range of strategic, economic, and reasons associated with technology and foreign policy. So let's hop into it.
Right, absolutely. Now, we've got two options here. You can hold forth on what you see as the basic points and argument of your book, and why you think that there is a real serious possibility of a conflict between the US and China, what you think that might consist of, and how you think that could be, the chances of that could be lowered appreciably, if not ended. Or I could try and do that, and I could summarize my view of what I think the book is all about, and you could tell me where I'm wrong. So it's up to you.
I'm relaxed, Michael. As others have said in Chinese history, with you in charge, I'm at ease. So, so over to you. You do the summary, and then I will supplement as necessary.
Okay, that's great. Well, first of all, it's very clear to me why you wrote this book. As I just said, you see China and the US moving towards what could be a severe crisis, if not conflict, within this decade, and you identify this decade as really the highest period of danger that the two countries are going to be in, likely. And you believe that this is made worse by the fact that both sides seem to assume that such a conflict is almost a virtual inevitability. You see a lot of danger in this decade because you see a determined and powerful Xi Jinping might press to resolve the Taiwan issue within that time frame as a major part of his legacy, using possibly military means. Or you think conflict might occur because both sides will be inclined to escalate in an inadvertent crisis over, say, the South China Sea, East China Sea, Korea, or something else. And then you cite and go through 10 possible scenarios of how these types of conflicts could very well occur, some deliberate, some, as I said, inadvertent, most of them to do with Taiwan. But all that said, you also most certainly believe that such a conflict is by no means inevitable. You say that incentives exist on both sides to create guardrails or manage strategic competition that can avoid such conflict, or at least reduce the likelihood of such conflict to a very great degree, and allow for some intense levels of competition, which you see as inevitable, and perhaps even some cooperation. And you point to as incentives for establishing these guardrails a common fear, really, of the scenarios that you outline and the huge damage they could do to both nations' long-term strategy and prosperity. The U.S., for its part, needs to revitalize itself in many ways, as you say, and therefore doesn't want a conflict. So it has an incentive to establish guardrails. And China needs more time to achieve what it regards as its necessary capabilities in the future to play a greater role in the world. You say that these guardrails should be worked out through sustained, closed-door, strategic discussions based on very honest and frank assessments of core priorities and red lines, discussions that US and Chinese leaders really don't often have. And you say, however, that these things should occur not publicly with a big public announcement and a joint signed statement or anything like that, not a formal grand bargain, but they should be established privately between the leaderships, negotiated by two senior leaders with great connections in the two sides, and that they should then involve a period of time going through the decade and perhaps beyond to try to keep the level of rivalry at a appreciable level. And you point to 6 different types of guardrails. One of them is an agreement on no cyber attacks on infrastructure. Another one is regarding Taiwan, to have the United States establish a much more strict one China policy that would include no high-level US visits to Taiwan or joint military exercises with Taiwan. But by the same token, China needs to reduce its own military saber rattling exercises near Taiwan. You think that both sides should agree regarding the South China Sea. China agree not to reclaim or militarize any more land in the South China Sea and have a respect for freedom of navigation operations. But by the same token, the US should also reduce its freedom of navigation operations and its own versions of what you might call saber rattling in the region. And then finally, as a 6th point, you also say that between China and Japan and their dispute over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, they should adopt something similar along those lines. And that these all would be really help in trying to avoid the kind of conflict that you see happening. You see this as difficult to do, establish these guardrails, but by no means impossible. You admit that the guardrails are not a final solution by any means. It's likely more a kind of way of kicking the can down the road, as you put it, regarding ultimate Sino-US outcomes. And it would probably or perhaps allow for more breathing room to possibly alter the current largely zero-sum strategic assessments of one side toward the other down the road. In other words, it buys time over a period of time. And the alternatives, in your view, look pretty grim if we don't establish these guardrails, given the impetus of both countries to adopt this kind of strategic rivalry that is in many ways very zero-sum. Have I got it right?
You have. Let me give you a 60-second supplement.
Great.
One, strategic red lines. I think you said before that these should be negotiated between both sides at a senior diplomatic level. The nuance I insert there is not so much negotiated as mutually advised. You will never achieve agreement on each other's red lines, but it's important for the other side to know that if certain red lines are crossed from the perspective of the other, then large-scale consequences will ensue. The second point is, beyond strategic red lines, managed strategic competition has 2 other dimensions. The second is, the first of those other dimensions is, aside from these core strategic red lines, that the rest of the relationship should be governed by all form of non-lethal strategic competition, which is allowed in foreign policy and the rest of security policy and trade and investment, capital markets, technology markets, and ideology as well. And then finally, the joint framework that I've recommended still provides sufficient political and diplomatic capital or space to allow mutually agreed areas of strategic collaboration where it's in the national interest of both sides to do so. And I specify climate, the next pandemic, given how much we screwed up the last one, together. That's China and the United States and all of us, frankly. Right. And thirdly, to continue to provide stability for global financial markets given the size of the two economies and financial systems. So with those two additions, Michael, your summary gets from me at least a 9.5 out of 10.
Thank you, Professor Rudd. So, well, I must say, I'd like to make a few comments and ask you a few questions about the book and your argument. First thing I would say, though, is there's a lot in it with which I agree. I think that it's very, very justifiable to see the U.S.-China dynamic now as being seriously, I don't know if you say broken, but in going in very bad directions and in ways that could really end up in conflict. Both countries certainly contribute to this, in my opinion, and I think you acknowledge that in the book. This is not just a one-sided thing, and yet, unfortunately, each side tends to just believe the other side is what is driving the dynamic. They tend to worst case each other. They tend, as you rightly say, to misread signals. I've been working with the Chinese for over 15 years on a crisis management series of interactions with them, which focuses very much on signaling. And in that, and we've done many, many different types of crises. And in that, you see how easily it is for the two sides to misinterpret the signals of the other in a crisis, to think that a certain, what was regarded or intended as a de-escalatory move is regarded, surprisingly, by the other side as exactly the opposite. So the need to have a clear understanding about reading signals that isn't there, and a need to have a better understanding about, as you put it, each side's perception environment, how they perceive themselves and each other, which they don't really understand nearly as much as they should. And as I said, they really don't have these strategic dialogues in a meaningful sense of the word in which you use it. And both of them both countries display, you refer to hyper-nationalism, and they have obviously ideologically based clashing beliefs about governance. So from all of that, I agree very much that there needs to be some kind of explicit strategic understandings of some form, or guardrails, or however I want to put it. And the Biden administration, of course, has spoken and used that term. But the question is, the devils are in the detail. And you really need to be able to be as clear as you can about what these guardrails are and how you can possibly get to them. But if I could, let me just sort of play devil's advocate here on a few points and ask you a question. Make a statement, ask a question. My first point is, I'm not so sure that both sides see conflict as virtually inevitable, and thus give them a strong sense of urgency to avoid it in the near to medium term. I think both sides seem to think that their policies, their own policies, can deter conflict and give them an advantage over the long term. And I think neither side seems to think that accepting limits on their security policies will create a better outcome for them. In other words, there's not as much urgency felt to create guardrails. There's more urgency to increase deterrence and to stop the other side and deter the other side from doing the worst thing. So I guess my question to you would be, why do you think that the two sides really look at conflict as likely to be inevitable? Or what's the best way to convey the urgency that the two leaderships really need to have in order to go forward and try to adopt these guardrails?
This is a great question, Michael, and something which I wrestled with, if you like, intellectually in writing the book. First point is, you and I are both students of international relations history. We know international relations history is littered with the carcasses of diplomatic signaling gone wrong. And you've been engaged at a much sharper edge of this in terms of your work with the Chinese on diplomatic signaling in recent years. I'm always haunted by the failure of diplomatic signaling in July of 1914, when we had a relatively minor incident occur, the assassination of the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right, who I guarantee no one in Australia or the United States had ever heard of prior to the First World War. That was in late June. In July, we had an appalling failure of diplomacy and an appalling failure of diplomatic signaling between the great powers. And then, to quote the immortal Barbara Tuchman, we had the guns of August on the 4th of August. And if you read the contemporary literature around 1914, nobody regarded crisis or war between powers as inevitable. And as you know, we were coming out of economic globalization.
Oh, we're getting some problem. You're dropping out from time to time there, Kevin.
I'm sorry about that. Is that better? Let me make sure that the link is better. Is that okay?
Yeah, that seems better now. Or well, no, you're still frozen again.
My apologies. I'll start that again. So on the question of 1914, my apologies. The link here was good.
Maybe you should turn off your video and just go
I
to the
will.
audio.
Should I try and come back into the link fresh? Is that the better thing? Yeah, better, Michael.
Okay.
I will try that. So the problem that we have with the precedent of 1914 is that diplomatic signaling in the absence of any guardrails failed miserably. And diplomatic signaling in the presence of maximum deterrence in terms of the naval race between Germany and Great Britain, for example, failed miserably to avoid conflict, crisis, and war. I'm always haunted by that. And if you read the book by my Australian compatriot called Sleepwalkers, by Christopher Clark, the Cambridge historian, of the events of 1914, written only several years ago, it is quite remarkable how these things unfold. The second reason, or the second point I advance in response to your argument, Michael, is this. Why would China and the United States see value in guardrails as opposed to deterrence? Conceptually, I argue this. Guardrails are not incompatible with deterrence. Guardrails, in fact, can presuppose the continued management of deterrence between Chinese and US force development in a whole range of weapon systems and similar technologies over time. This is not a zero-sum game between the two propositions. I regard guardrails as, on balance, stabilizing, but I also regard deterrence as equally stabilizing if effectively executed. And my final point would be, Michael, if I look currently at what the United States and Taiwan are doing, for example, and the Taiwanese efforts to effectively rebuild their national defense capability on the one hand, and the United States to reconfigure its force posture in East Asia and the West Pacific under Indo-Pacific demand, these moves towards changing the deterrence equation are already underway, for which there'll be Chinese countermeasures as well. Therefore, I see the two as entirely compatible, not mutually contradictory.
Right. Okay. So, and it seems also that, I mean, you believe that the historical occurrence, especially in recent history, of conflict, despite the views of different actors that war could be avoided, they in some various ways they walked into conflict, and that kind of undesired conflict is quite possible in the U.S.-China case because of the problem of signaling, because of the problem of understanding each other's motives that exist. Of course, you often hear, you probably heard this when you talk to some American officials and military officers, oh, we know completely what the Chinese think. We know what their motives are. We know where their strategic or security perceptions are. So we know exactly where they're going, and we know how to deter them. So reaching some sort of guardrails on what to do and not to do in a use of force situation, that some of them, I think they believe it's not as would not be as useful, because you would be exposing yourself to limitations that you don't necessarily want to undertake. That's the argument, at least.
If that is the argument, Michael, we need to ask ourselves the fundamental question. Therefore, is the US-China relationship more strategically stable now than it was 5 or 10 years ago or 15 years ago? I argue it is not.
Right.
If that logic was self-sustaining in its effectiveness, then we'd need to find evidence for it. I do not see that evidence. Instead, what I see is a whole bunch of metal flying around the South China Sea, in and around Taiwan, the East China Sea, and frankly, a whole series of random cyber events, which caused me to become increasingly uncertain whether, in fact, the parameters of diplomatic and or military signaling are maintaining and enhancing stability or, in fact, acting in the reverse direction.
Right.
There's a further point as well. Military experts in the United States may have a view as to what constitutes the most effective deterrence against an individual Chinese action in a particular theater or sub-theater, and therefore understandably will not want to have their, quote, hands tied, unquote, by any crazy doctrine dreamt up by diplomats in a one-on-one negotiation between the principals and the two capitals. I understand that. But let me hazard one further point. Ultimately, decisions on peace and war are made by civilian officials in the United States and in the collective West. And whatever military officials may think, civilian officials will have a broader and necessarily broader perspective. And if we were to revisit, for example, the dynamics of what occurred in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, there was a clear division of opinion between the military leadership and how to effect proper forms of deterrence against then Soviet Union on the one hand, and the ultimate decisions adopted by John Fitzgerald Kennedy on the other. So I think there are important countervailing arguments on this question. And I go back to my underlying premise. There's nothing ultimately incompatible between a set of stabilizing guardrails on the one hand versus a continued and effective set of deterrent measures in terms of force preparedness and force operations, and within parameters, forced responses in order to maximize stability. And one final footnote, Michael, is the United States military establishment may be of the view that they fully understand Chinese strategic thinking. As someone who has studied much of this for the last 40 years of my life, I'm not so sure that I still understand it either. Right. I've read the military classics. I've read Chinese international behaviors. Right. But I also understand it's a Marxist-Leninist party with a doctrine of struggle within it, which has been rehabilitated by Xi Jinping, which has a far greater tolerance for what I describe as calculated strategic risk than we've ever had in either the Deng period, the Zhang period, or the Hu Jintao period. In other words, the appetite for strategic risk has changed, and the appetite for struggle, both at home and abroad, has changed, explaining that through a Marxist-Leninist concept of Chinese communism. I think this is a subjective factor which needs to be incorporated into the analysis as well, rather than everything being a pure military desktop exercise.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Another point that I'd like to get your view on, and that I also try to wrestle with at times, is exactly when you look at China and its leadership and where it's moving today and its policies, domestic and foreign, what kind of and how large scale of a threat and how near term of a threat, put aside the possibility of accidents that could occur through inadvertent escalation that you could get. And I should say that in many of the kinds of simulations I've been involved in the past, the leaders who have in many cases been former pretty senior people on both sides, when they got into a serious crisis, the desire was very, very much to de-escalate and try and get out of the crisis. Now, I understand that now the calculations about doing that and the risk tolerance may be different. But nonetheless, in looking at China as a threat per se and how much it might deliberately want to use force, I tend to think that the threat is not nearly as great as some might think, and perhaps you might think. Now, as you outline in your paper, regarding China's confidence and its capabilities, it's entering a period of enormous challenges and strain. And indeed, I think many of the factors that you point to in your book suggest to me that the trend lines could possibly not favor China all that much in a global competition over time. There's a real issue of the long-term sustainability of Xi's more ideological, statist, and repressive growth model. There's the fact of democratic decline. You cite all of these in your book, the huge domestic pollution problems, low and dropping productivity levels, whether China can close that semiconductor gap that you discuss, and the fact that Xi's assertive attitudes and policies have not exactly won a lot of overseas allies in recent years. And of course, if the Ukraine war goes much worse, and if China is in some way more deeply blamed for supporting Russia in it, its position could become even worse. So I guess from that perspective, I think it does behoove us to be a little cautious as to how potent a threat the Chinese might be able to actually make over the next several years and decades. What's your view on that?
Those are all excellent reflections, Michael, on the complexity of not just the current decade ahead, but the one which follows. And as you correctly identify in your preamble, the difference between conflict by accident as opposed to conflict by design on the part of the Chinese, most particularly. The first point I'd make in response to that is that we need to be very clear about the nature of the difference of political leadership under Xi Jinping compared with his predecessors. As I said before, there is now a greater confidence in Chinese capabilities across the board at the senior political level, not necessarily shared by those responsible for military leadership or those responsible for economic and financial leadership, right. But at the senior Xi Jinping level, there is a high degree of confidence. Secondly, when countries are led by, quote, men of history, unquote, like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, they have a predisposition to want to change the map. And they also have a predisposition to change the map within their political lifetime. And therefore, to take the historical opportunity which history presents to them. And the third point is this. If I read carefully the internal Chinese ideological literature, and as you know, ideology and Marxist-Leninist discourse is the way in which the regime talks to itself, the change in the tonality and content of that discourse over a long period of time, by which I mean the last 5 years at least, and arguably the last 8 or 9 years under Xi Jinping, has changed. It is not just the Chinese patting themselves on the back and saying we now have the rise of the East and the decline of the West. We no longer have the Chinese simply patting themselves on the back, saying that China has now moved to the center of the global stage. It's not just them patting themselves on the back when they say that China's rise is now unavoidable and inevitable, and that the forces of historical determinism are on China's side. And again, this is where I come down to questions of mirror imaging of American strategic thinking in relation to ultimate Chinese political strategic thinking, is that these deep ideological, ideational, and leadership-specific motivational forces are also at work within the ultimate decision-making framework of the Chinese system. So that is my core first point. The second is this, that when you look, therefore, at the future timetable, you are right to point out those elements of my book which say that the medium-term scenario for China, by which I broadly describe as the 2030s, is more problematic because of the outworking of the drivers of economic growth. By then we have declining population. By then we have an acceleration of shrinking workforce. We have aging of population. We have other demands on the Chinese budget as social security and health begin to eat into the otherwise limitless demands of the Chinese national defense budget and the requirements of its military. And beyond that, again, you have other factors at play in terms of the sustainability of the current set of statist, partyist economic policy settings, which I argue, and have argued recently in a number of pieces of mine in the Wall Street Journal, are beginning to drag down on China's long-term economic growth rate far more heavily than would normally be associated with an economy at this stage of low to middle income or lower middle income status. So for those reasons, absent an ideological change at the top on the economy, but present being still flagging productivity growth and frankly, much more seriously, flagging population and workforce growth. Mm-hmm. For those reasons, China's medium-term growth prospects begin to go down from 5% to 4%, right, to trend of 2 to 3%, arguing the proposition that when we get to the 2030s, if the United States is passed by China as GDP measured by market exchange rates, as others have argued recently, it may not be by much, in which case I return to my thesis. The 2020s, and in particular the late 2020s, I see as the decade of living dangerously as Xi Jinping is smart enough to understand what his historical window of opportunity might be. Hence the requirement for guardrails, hence the requirement for mutually reinforcing deterrence as well in the decade ahead.
Sure. I mean, that's definitely a possibility. I mean, you're basically making the argument that if Xi Jinping anticipates that problems will grow, despite his apparent outward optimism about China having time on its side and having long-term objectives of establishing itself as a great power by 2049, underneath it all, they may be really concerned in ways that cause them to think that by trying to deal with some of these intractable problems like Taiwan in the shorter term, where they still have some strength, they would be able to resolve them in some successful way. Of course, the counter argument to that is that, and I tend to ascribe to this from looking at the Chinese motivation, is that they still don't have a sufficient enough level of confidence in their near to medium term capabilities, both military and economic, that they are willing to take the risk of using force and suffer the consequences of it, which would be considerable. And I say as part of that I don't fully sign on to the idea that China today has a decisive military edge over the US in the Western Pacific regarding Taiwan that would give them the confidence of success, especially in this decade. I think the US can maintain considerable costs of a Chinese attack. I'm not talking about regaining predominance or primacy, but I'm talking about the ability to call into question very significantly the capacity of the Chinese to succeed in a Taiwan scenario. And that's based upon what I hear from individuals I know in the defense establishment about these famous simulations that show the Chinese always winning, which some others I know in the establishment are very critical of, and about the fact that the United States has embarked on a very large increase in anti-ship cruise missiles and long-range distance anti-ship cruise missiles in very big numbers. And a lot of the simulations that I've been in often come down to just that. If you're going to stop an actual attack on Taiwan, you have to be able to sink those ships. And so I would just say that I think the Chinese, they're probably very aware of this, because as you said, the PLA leadership, they're not, pie in the sky optimists about what they can do. They are very cautious in many ways in talking about their capabilities vis-a-vis the United States. So I agree that China is working to acquire enough capabilities to deter the US from intervening over Taiwan. I agree with you on that. I think that's absolutely their desire. They don't want to use force, but I don't necessarily see them acquiring that capability to a high level of certainty within this decade. And I also think that in this decade, there will remain a high likelihood that the US would intervene and intervene heavily in a Taiwan crisis. So I don't see the US as being deterred. I see it being concerned about having lost its past primacy. But I also think that the level of damage and the level of really significant capabilities on both sides is such that it's a really high stakes kind of a roll of the dice, and neither side would be willing to take it, I think, unless they felt pushed into it, unless they felt they were backed into it and had little other alternatives. And one way that might happen is if the United States significantly degrades, eviscerates, alters its one China policy and shows that it really is not interested in reunification at all under any conditions, and regards Taiwan as a strategic asset to be kept close and kept separate from China. So that kind of leads me to feel that if you're talking about the most provocative force that could create conflict over the Taiwan Strait in the near term, near to medium term, I would say it's more the United States than it is China. Because I think there are people in the US government and on the Hill who are very willing to conclude from the Ukraine war that insufficient deterrence led to a despot invading this country. Similarly, insufficient deterrence will lead the Chinese and Xi Jinping to attack Taiwan. Therefore, we have to reassess the basics of Taiwan policy. That is of concern to me. And if that were to occur, I would agree with you. I mean, we would be in a conflict, in a whole hell of hurt. But I'm not so sure that is something that's highly likely. It could occur depending upon who's president in 2024, of course. And when you listen to the statements made by Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, and others, you can see a lot of this kind of language is circulating around in the Republican Party. So that concerns me, frankly, more than Xi Jinping does.
I think where I come from, Michael, on those points is that I have had over the years a lot of engagement with both Chinese and American military commanders, and of course, Australia's own defense establishment. As you know, Australia is America's probably oldest continuing ally if you go back to the First World War.
Right.
So we've had a lot to do with each other over the years. The second is, but apart from being a professional foreign service guy, which I have been, I've also been a politician. And when I spend my time dealing with the political class in both countries, I experience different realities to those which are reflected in my long-standing professional engagements with the militaries of both countries. There is an intersecting logic between the two worlds, but it is not a coterminous logic between the two worlds. Right. And secondly, you've pointed to one set of, shall we say, political possibilities within the US, and I follow carefully, as you do, the unfolding dynamics of the Republican Party in particular, where China and Taiwan have become the new organizing principles for who can outright whom within the for the successor mantle of Donald Trump for Republican Party leadership. That of itself potentially represents a whole new dynamic, as you've indicated, in the future strategic stability of the US-China relationship, which I would argue further argues in favor of embracing an overall strategy of managed strategic competition in order to at least maximize the lines of communication at a political level in order to manage the tensions which come out of any change of US domestic political posture on, for example, Taiwan independence, Taiwan's future, and Taiwan's defense and military status in the eyes of the United States.
Right.
And I think the other point I would raise is, similarly, when I sit down with PLA generals, they are a very cautious crew. You know them,
yep.
I know them. And if you drink long and hard enough with them, they're like generals I know around the world. They are just generally not keen on blowing each other's brains out in a war.
Right.
They are professional, they are trained, they know the craft of arms, they know the profession of arms, but they also know what it's like to see someone's head blown off. They don't generally like it. Yeah. And therefore, my experience of generals the world over, with very rare exceptions, is that they would prefer not to go to war. However, what I sense in the Chinese domestic debate at both the political and the military level is a whole series of tensions. Look at for example, operationalization of the Chinese military reform program launched in 2015, the reorganization of the military regions from 7 down to 5, the creation of joint command structures between the various arms of the armed forces, the downsizing the overall size of the PLA, and all the tensions which arise from that internally.
Right.
The PLA internally as a machine is in a state of flux right now. However, they know that they have Xi Jinping breathing down their neck in terms of having a capability as early as 2027 to act should the external political requirements or the internal political requirements dictate that such action should occur. So I seek in my overall argument to bring together both the military logic as experienced by both sides, the United States and China, and their establishments, but both of whom I have deep professional respect for. And secondly, the wild dynamics of politics in both countries, which frankly can push us in different directions.
Yep.
And to conclude on that point, like yourself, I've read the Chinese military classics. I've read Sun Tzu's Art of War. I know what Article 1 of Sun Tzu's Art of War is. War is a great matter of state, not to be embraced lightly. If you lose the war, you lose the state. This is etched in the cerebral cortex of every single Chinese military leader. But when you look at some of the messianic qualities that you see in Xi Jinping's leadership posture, what I detect and observe over time is a greater appetite for calculated risk than I've seen on the part of any of his predecessors. Were we to have this conversation under any of Xi Jinping's predecessors, you and I would be saying yay and amen on everything. I'm not so sure when you've got a cocktail of Xi on the one hand and Mike Pompeo et al. On the other, that it is necessarily a continuation of the previous reality and assumptions underpinning it.
Yep. Oh, yeah, I agree with you. I think the dangers are certainly there, and there is a need to try to establish these kinds of guardrails. I guess one question I have in that respect is, can you create, you say in your book that you can set up these 6 different guardrails, and you might have others in mind that you didn't write about. And at the same time, China and the United States can continue to compete vigorously, and including compete for primacy, either regionally or globally. And yet at the same time, that competition would not lead them to cross any agreed upon or tacitly agreed upon red lines. But I guess my question is, if each side truly seeks primacy as a vital interest, why would they continue to observe the guardrails if one or the other sees their opponent as clearly winning? If you're talking about a winning in this competition, and the winning is pretty darn zero sum, which is primacy, then it seems to me that the impetus should be not in pushing primacy, but in pushing a concept of balance, in which both sides recognize certain limits. Neither side is capable of or thinks it can achieve dominance at acceptable cost. And you establish a stable situation based upon a deliberate and stable balance, which would include the guardrails that you talk about. But it would also include the idea that we're here competing, but we're not competing because we think one side must dominate the other.
Again, the logic of deterrence and balance is something very much alive, both in my realist frame for understanding international relations and strategic relations. And I accept that, and that's reflected in what I say in the book. That is a core component of the logic. But secondly, I cannot simply wish away my observation of Chinese political and strategic literature internally and in the internal discourse of the party to conclude that China is seeking to be in a dominant position militarily, strategically, and economically in East Asia and the West Pacific as soon as is possible, partly to achieve their Taiwan objective, but partly as an expression of what they believe to be their historical mandate in East Asia and the West Pacific. I know that there is a lot of trite commentary about a Chinese equivalent of a Monroe Doctrine, but I'm always surprised that when I run around the Chinese think tank establishment, the number of times that I'm confronted with Monroe Doctrine logic. You guys have a Western Hemisphere. Well, we're about to have an Eastern Hemisphere. Thank you very much. Goodbye, Uncle Sam. Right. What did you do? What did you do in the Western Hemisphere? Well, you sought dominance. You didn't seek balance with the British or the French or the Spanish or anyone else in the Western Hemisphere. You said, so long, guys, get the hell out of our hemisphere. And the Chinese observation said, that was one of several preconditions for America obtaining its global great power status, which was to ensure its absolute strategic dominance in the Western Hemisphere. And as you know, that has a series of untidy historical realities associated with it in America's dealings with the various countries of Central and Latin America. But the Chinese reflection internally, as I deduce it, is very much that however we may wish it away, that their operational behavior, not just in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and over Taiwan, are not simply in relation to the set of discrete concerns which arise from the Korean Peninsula, but also their broader interest in a more compliant Korea, period, North and South, to China's overall hemispheric objectives and more deeper sense of, as shall we say, cultural legitimacy, and what would be described in the literature as the Sinic world, SINIC, not CYNIC world. And when I observe Chinese behaviors in Southeast Asia, I see similar patterns. And therefore, I cannot wish away what I observe, both in the literature and in observable Chinese behaviors about the desire for dominance in East Asia and the West Pacific. My final point, though, in response to that, Michael, is that it may well be that as a consequence of what I describe as a managed strategic competition, incorporating both red lines, non-lethal competition in other domains, plus strategic cooperation, and a continuing application within that framework of the principles of deterrence. It may well be that the continuing consequence of such an approach is, in fact, balance rather than dominance, and that, in fact, would be the operational objective. But I cannot remove from the calculus the clear declaratory intent and, in my judgment, operational intent of what China now seeks to do in, quote, the Eastern Hemisphere, unquote.
This is a subject that I'd love to have more opportunity to talk with you at some length, because I have a somewhat different view of it, but I'm certainly willing to be persuaded otherwise. I'm not quite as convinced that the Chinese regard dominance in the Western Pacific as an absolutely vital national interest that they could not sacrifice. I think they're willing to settle for less, given certain policies. But anyway, that's a judgment call based upon our different reading of and conversations with different Chinese. So I can certainly see why you believe what you believe. I think it's less the case globally for a whole host of reasons. But we don't need to go into those now. I don't see the Chinese as anywhere near a position where they could vie for global predominance in the next several decades. It's hard for me to
apply. No, I agree with that in terms of their global reach. But again, there's a keen study of the United States and its evolution as a global power. You know that, I know that. The Chinese academies are full of studies of the rise of great powers and of the most recent global great power in particular, namely the United States.
Right.
If you asked Americans at the time of Teddy Roosevelt and what the United States was then doing in the Western Hemisphere, whether it then concluded that it must be a globally dominant power, that would not have been response from the US body politic. It was not the response either in World War I and prior to the provocations of World War II from Japan in the Pacific. It was not the US position then either.
Right.
So the Chinese have observed an evolution of America's status as a global power. But the Chinese position, in my view, is one of convergence with an American view concerning its own hemisphere as a necessary precondition for dealing with its unresolved territorial issues in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and Taiwan. And furthermore, as a consequence of that, laying out a series of broad preparatory positions, including the expansion of its blue water Navy capabilities, against longer-term contingencies. Does the base in Djibouti, for example, equal a Chinese determination to boot the US Fifth Fleet out of the Gulf? No. But is it rolling out a series of capabilities which embrace certain possibilities for the future? Definitely yes. That's the way in which the PLA thinks and operates. So I have a more granular view, I think, of how the Chinese basically roll out possibilities and then occupy the terrain which some of those possibilities then present in the real world, rather than being a watertight blueprint for every country in the world and its need for coaling stations in Finland in the future against a future scenario against whomever.
Well, I very much agree with that. I don't see the Chinese as having, there's not some document hidden in the bowels of Zhongnanhai that says, here's our strategic plan for conquering the world. I mean, I think they are opportunistic. I think they do look upon how far they need to go and what they need to do based in large part on what they see as the disposition of forces, as they say, and the way in which the United States and other countries are treating them. And so there's a dynamic. When people ask me, how threatening is China? I often say to people, that's not really the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what is the relationship between the United States and China that makes it a threatening situation to both? And I think it's a certain dynamic that arises from the assumptions that both sides tend to hold towards the other and oneself, that just reinforces their worst case assumptions. And so it drives them to do things that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise do. But it gets into all kinds of different details about their behavior here and there and other places. But what I'd like to do in the little time we have available, and I do want to get to some questions from the audience here, and I think we have about another 20 minutes or so. I did want to just push you a little bit on some of your guardrail propositions. You state that to be successful, these guardrails need to be verifiable. That's important. You just can't have trust but verify, as Reagan said, because there is no trust. So you have to have, you're right. So you have to have some kind of guardrails that really the two sides are sort of compelled to observe for various reasons, because not observing them will be of greater damage to them than otherwise. So you have to be able to convincingly make that point to them. And I guess part of the problem here, one is how do you make that point, of course, which we've touched on, but the other one is how do you verify in some cases? One of your things is no cyber attacks on infrastructure. Hard thing to verify. I mean, it's very hard to identify where these attacks come from in a high level of surety that would then justify you breaking off the guardrails, if you will, and resorting to much more serious reactions, which you say should be the consequence if they're violated. So that's sort of a concern. The other one is changes in the direction of the one China policy, given what's been going on in the United States. I totally agree with you, Kevin, about what needs to happen in U.S.-Taiwan policy, and we're moving in the exact opposite direction there, and it's not good. But how do you deal with that? How do you establish those kinds of guardrails in dealing with the Congress or in dealing with the Republican administration? I mean, it's going to be very hard to do that, I think. And then the issue of saber rattling, per se, the Chinese doing it in various ways around Taiwan or in the South China Sea. There are questions of definition. What is a threshold? What is too much? You're not going to do away with it altogether. Do the Chinese need to pledge that they will not deploy certain types of weapons? So you get down to sort of an arms control understanding with the Chinese. You don't do certain things, we won't do certain things. Otherwise, you'll get the kind of vagary that we had when Xi Jinping in the Rose Garden says he had the we Zhongzhihua. He had no intention to militarize Zhonghai, the South China Sea. And yet that wasn't a promise. I didn't see that as a promise. He said he had no intention of doing that. Well, you could argue, he would argue, we haven't really militarized the South China Sea by the way in which the installations, what they are. You haven't got aircraft deployed down there on a permanent basis. There are no warships down there. So, you get this fudgy sort of, well, we're not really militarizing. So that's a problem I see as well. And then so it's a question of doing that and defining what thresholds mean. So I'm sure you're aware of all of these, but I just sort of raise them by saying it's not going to be easy.
No, Michael, and the book is at pains to point out, none of this is easy. All of it is really hard.
Totally.
And in each of it is an advanced technical working group involving a combination of cyber and military officials on both sides of the table, in order to know precisely what we are talking about with a level of granularity which is actually meaningful. I go back, however, to my corollary, which is if it's all fine and dandy to use broad diplomatic and military signaling and what I describe as the imprecise science of push and shove to determine where operational red lines actually lie, I'm kind of a little more conservative than that. I'm not so sure that has landed us in a more stable strategic environment with the Chinese now, as opposed to a decade ago. That's my operating premise. Secondly, part of the reason for writing the book and for being, as it were, loud and proud on the question of managed strategic competition is to provoke exactly the debate you and I are engaged in right now. And the core question involving each of the 6 categories which I identify in the book is to force, let's just say on the American side and separately on the Chinese side, a set of conclusions between the pole mill establishments of both countries, whether in fact a guardrail is on balance more stabilizing or less stabilizing.
Right.
My argument on balance, applying broad strategic logic to it, given where we've got to, is that it would be more stabilizing. But it may be that a technical working group of experts in 4 of the 6 categories comes back and says, yes, it would be more stabilizing, but in 2 of the 6, it would be on balance destabilizing to try and force this to a level of new clarity.
Right.
But so far, I do not believe the pole mill establishments of both countries have done that work either internally, let alone bilaterally, in order to reach that rational conclusion. What I'm arguing in overall terms, though, is that when you throw in to this overall equation the unpredictable politics of Xi Jinping's man of history moment, plus the unpredictability of what I describe as the curious admixture of internal Republican politics on playing Taiwan into domestic internal Republican Party primaries.
Right.
This creates a whole new set of dynamics, which puts it into an equation which is no longer a neat clinical military equation between 2 professional sets of militaries who think they know what the other thinks, who think they know how to handle it, and then suddenly you've got this wild new sheriff who arrives at the Last Chance Saloon in Dodge City, 1861, and a shootout starts, and it frankly defies all of our pre-existing models. So therefore, I argue, let us at least go through this exercise.
Well, I agree with that. I very much agree with that. I think, it's yes, it's going to be tough. Yes, it would be difficult to enforce, but the alternatives don't look good. And it's better to try than not to try. I think on balance, it's probably better. I just wrestle with the questions as you do, and people ask me these things because I made an analysis some years ago about trying to create a stable balance in Asia using exactly some of these suggestions that you raised in your book. So I found that particularly gratifying in that sense. In our few remaining moments, let me get to some of the questions, if that's okay with you, Kevin.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do so.
David Ednick Jr. Asks, how has the war in Ukraine affected thinking in Beijing regarding global geopolitics and local region power projection in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific? And I guess that would involve really the Taiwan issue primarily. How do you see the Ukraine conflict affecting the Chinese calculus?
Yeah, Michael, you and I think about this a lot. And in fact, you raised an excellent point before, which is how does the Ukraine phenomenon affect certain American strategic thinking and Republican thinking about Taiwan in the future as well, and perhaps wrong conclusions being drawn in terms of maximizing long-term stability. But your questioner asks about the Chinese calculus. I do not believe it necessarily changes Xi Jinping's personal timetable for when he would ideally like to bring Taiwan back into the motherland's warm and tender embrace. Their term, not mine. Whereas the observable challenges in Ukraine are about the military's capacity to overwhelm a neighboring land neighbor, as opposed to what would be the largest amphibious operation since the D-Day landings, certainly since much bigger than Incheon. This is very big. And then furthermore, the financial vulnerability of the Russian system to US and allied sanctions. These will all be subject to detailed wargaming operations by the Chinese as they seek to interpolate the data. So the professional class will learn a lot from this. It'll enhance levels of caution at their level, but I do not see any evidence that the political worldview of Xi Jinping on his historical mission about returning Taiwan to Chinese sovereignty necessarily changes as a result.
Right. I agree entirely with that. I just don't see the Chinese leadership concluding from the Ukraine war that Putin's rolling of the dice really paid off, and that they can launch a similar sort of attack on Taiwan because the opportunity is ripe for them to do so, and the U.S. is distracted in Europe. I mean, these kinds of conclusions to me just do not jibe with what I know about both not just Chinese leaders, but also American military people who are not so simplistic as to think that they can only chew gum or walk, but not both. So
exactly. So it's the kind of strategic analysis that in the old days you would see on the back of a cereal packet, a packet of cornflakes, rather than a serious piece of analysis.
Let me see if I can find one or two more here. Well, there's one very fundamental question, which either you or I could, which is, what is the strategic need for the US to keep Taiwan separate from China? Because you've had this raised. I mean, it has been raised in congressional testimony by a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And it was, in my view, inadequately batted down by the administration. So you have this notion out there that Taiwan is a potential strategic node or strategic asset in defense of the first island chain. And that tends to be the argument because of its proximity to Japan, because it is a large island with many military facilities on it. The Chinese get access to the open ocean in the Western Pacific without any difficulty. Even all the ports are on the west side, not on the east side so much. But it also gives them access to technology on Taiwan that they may not otherwise have in semiconductor and in other areas. And it gives them very closer proximity, although I think this is incorrect, to the Senkakus or the Diaoyu Islands. But the idea is it could be seen as a stepping stone, as both an ability to enter the Western Pacific and a stepping stone to make possible attacks on Japan or other countries in the immediate proximity. What's your take on this?
Probably at 2 or 3 levels. One is, if China was to successfully militarily take Taiwan, I think you could more or less kiss Senkaku Diaoyu goodbye, because that would be the next step. And that assumes, of course, that Japan was not already materially engaged in the Taiwan struggle itself.
Right.
Given changes in recent declaratory policy by the government of Japan, and particularly given the relevance of US forces in Okinawa and elsewhere for Taiwan-related scenarios. I have a slightly different take about the inherent strategic significance of Taiwan to the United States, other than its strategic utility. And that is the body blow to American global prestige of surrendering a viable little democracy, which has grown out of an authoritarian military dictatorship, and a robust and open society, and a remarkably performing economy with extraordinary achievements in technological innovation, to simply consign that to history and basically say, well, that's what happened to Hong Kong and that's what's happening to Taiwan.
Right.
Would deal such a moral body blow to American global prestige and standing in the world, and that it would be deeply delegitimizing of the United States in the eyes of the democratic world. The second point is that while the Taiwan Relations Act, as you know and I know full well, is not a mutual defense treaty, the truth is that the rest of America's Pacific allies and America's European allies, if it's sort of a pusillanimous response by the United States to a Chinese military move against Taiwan, then the rest of the allied world would say, what value is my alliance? And frankly, I think that deals a parallel blow to America's global reliability as an alliance partner around the world, right, and would then trigger a series of secondary consequences in terms of countries going nuclear and God knows whatever else in order to sustain their own national security. So right. I think they're the two relevant considerations, rather than the intrinsics of here is a nice strategic asset for the United States on Treasure Island, 180 kilometers off the Chinese coast.
Oh, sure. I agree. I mean, I think it's certainly the case, the argument that there is a very strong case to be made that the United States cannot just simply turn its back on Taiwan for all the reasons you just enumerated. But there's also, the issue as to whether or not the United States could do more to try to move both sides in directions that would lessen the likelihood of conflict between them. Now, people always resist this because they say, oh, that's mediator. And you ask State Roy or people, and they'll say, U.S. should never get in between these two countries, these two places. But I think that there is an argument that could be made that you could investigate how it's possible to be able to influence incentives along with other countries in the region who certainly don't want to see conflict over Taiwan and they don't want to be dragged into it. How you could change the incentive structure to move in more positive directions by getting both sides to do certain things that they might not otherwise do because they just distrust the other side from doing it. So I think there's a need to have that kind of a discussion within US policy circles at some point, because I think we're moving in that direction. People are deeply questioning the underlying rationale for US policy towards Taiwan in many ways. And the Chinese are deeply sensitive and paranoid almost about what the United States may be doing. So I think there is a reason for thinking about how we can adopt a different approach on this. I mean, I'm not by any means advocating for cutting Taiwan loose, but I think there is a legitimate reason for assessing that whole policy long term in a somewhat different way. Anyway, let me just I wanted to ask another question that had to do with the China-Russia relationship, which was, and especially in light of the US strong support for Ukraine. Nassim Kadar asks, what is the impact on US-Chinese efforts to try to improve their relations? In other words, the impact of the China-Russia relationship and how it seems to be evolving on not so much the Taiwan issue, but the overall prospects for improving US-China relations. What are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
My own view of Russia-China is that it's gone too far in terms of being a fundamentally reconsolidated strategic relationship to entertain any fundamental breach or shift in the future. I think that door was still open until about 2014, but after the Russian invasion of Crimea then, and the first move into Donetsk and Luhansk, that frankly, if you went to Moscow then, as I did, and spoke with Russian leaders about their view of China, it was still, frankly, a remote relationship. Yeah. When I go to Moscow, that I haven't been for some years, but when I speak to Russian colleagues in the think tank community and those associated with the official community in Moscow about their view of China as of 2019, 2021, this has been a massive transformation and a product of Russia's own financial and economic and, frankly, political and strategic vulnerability.
Right.
Furthermore, the Chinese have seen this as enormously advantageous for themselves, reconsolidates benign relationship with always a troublesome neighbor, Russia, enables them to continue to concentrate all their strategic assets in dealing with their principal opponent and adversary potentially in the world, the United States, and continuing to mobilize or work with Russia or to use Russia more accurately, or to rely upon Russia perhaps more accurately again, to provide a rolling strategic distraction to the United States in secondary and tertiary theaters around the world, in which category you would put, Syria, Libya, Ukraine in some respects as well. And then from the Chinese perspective, again, a reliable long-term supplier of commodities energy, agricultural, and in other domains as well. So I see this as now a mutually reinforcing relationship at a level of deep strategy, quite apart from whatever alchemy exists in the Vladimir Putin Xi Jinping personal relationship when they go and hunt bears together or whatever they do on their holidays with one another.
That's quite an image. Let me just end with a kind of a hypothetical. I know it's not always good to try to address hypotheticals, but let's assume that China in fact does continue to grow, and it really exceeds U.S. growth by quite a significant level. If it's going to reach half of U.S. GDP, it's going to grow twice of that of the United States, it seems. And it could get even larger, maybe 2 times the United States, and be able to deploy much large numbers of economic military assets all around Asia, and try to create this environment that you talk about in your book of sort of succeeding without firing a shot. Now, if and as it moves in that sort of a direction, and we don't have any major conflict and crisis, but the Chinese still are acquiring this kind of capability, and our relative capability is, as a result, to some degree diminished, at least within that theater. Do you see the possibility of the United States having to reconfigure and reassess the role of its alliances in the region? And what I mean, and I don't mean all of them, what I mean by that is that some of the alliances the United States has with Thailand, with the Philippines, et cetera, you might be able to make the argument in this future that providing a ironclad security guarantee to these countries is really unsustainable, that you can't really be able to make that work and make it credible. And it could instead draw the United States into conflicts with China over one or the other of those countries, taking just those 2 examples. So would it be better to transform those alliance relationships into something that was less overtly security-based and something that's more political and economically based, without, however, doing the same thing to relations with Japan or Australia? Is there a basis, in other words, based upon exposure, vital interest, et cetera, to make a distinction in this future world I'm talking about in American alliances? What do you think of that?
On the question of grand strategy, which is where this goes in many respects, Michael, I'd make just a couple of points and then finish on Thailand and the Philippines. The first is Chinese grand strategy, in my view, is pretty clear. Turn themselves into the indispensable economic partner of every country in the world. Use their market leverage both in goods, services, and in finance to leverage foreign policy compliance with China's regional and global ambitions. And as you say, to secure victory without ever firing a shot. Secondly, Chinese grand strategy is at the same time to develop sufficient military capability to cause anyone to conclude that if they were going to consider firing a shot, it would end badly.
Right.
But both arms of this strategy are designed to secure a policy objective without firing a shot. So let's just assume that that bald-faced haiku summary of Chinese grand strategy is accurate, for which we would generate 7,000 seminars just from that set of statements alone. But go to the next proposition.
That's a conservative estimate. Okay, go ahead.
Unfortunately, you and I both know all the guys and girls involved in this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So we go to the next proposition.
At the bit.
That the United States have an effective counter grand strategy. What it does in terms of the second part of that equation, in terms of effective military deterrence, you and I have discussed in this exchange. But beyond that, again, the missing piece of US grand strategy remains the economy and trade. So long as the Congress, who may be contemplating increasingly bellicose postures towards China over Taiwan, remains spellbound by the new protectionist voodoo, which is descended as some sort of cloak over the top of rational public policy analysis in the United States,
right.
And turns its back on free trade agreements with Asia and Europe, then frankly, the United States is in a net losing position. And the single biggest additive to the rebuilding of American effective global deterrence is not just through technology and what you do with semiconductors, and not just through the formidable power of the United States military, of which I'm deeply respectful, but it is frankly this missing piece which the US political and policy class currently find to be too hard.
Right.
Final point, just on the question of the military equation itself, I have always been perplexed analytically by the nature of the US security guarantee to the Kingdom of Thailand, and where that could land, given where Thailand is drifting in terms of its own geopolitics and geoeconomics with the People's Republic of China. And given the complexities of Thai domestic politics between the military, the monarchy, the political class, and the corporate class, who are increasingly, frankly, dominated by China. And so for those sorts of reasons, this is a live scenario. Right. But ultimately, I would say this, Michael, even we're dealing with hypotheses here, the act of rewriting a bilateral security treaty with mutual security obligations would of itself be destabilizing of your other alliances in the region. Mm-hmm. It would be subjected to such forensic analysis by your other security partners that they would see this as the thin edge of the wedge for Uncle Sam having a huge overdose of neo-isolationism, America firstism, and the restism as the United States begins incrementally withdrawing from the world. Yeah. So my caution would be not to, for those reasons.
Yeah, I certainly understand those reasons. I heard them many times, but I think it's worth considering over a period of time, which it indeed would take. And we're talking more in terms of decades than anything else. And it would have to come alongside certain very deep discussions with other American allies and what that would mean for the US relationship with them, that would reassure them so that they don't feel that they're being abandoned. And it would be in the context of not fully abandoning each other. I doubt the word abandonment would be used by anybody. So it would be redefining the nature of the alliances in some ways. But anyway, I think
there's an Afghanistan overhang here, which we should bear in mind.
That's right. But we're sort of grappling with developing. Quincy is very much oriented towards a restraint dimension on US foreign policy, and we're sort of struggling with, in the Asia context, very different from the Middle East. What does a restraint policy look like in Asia? A responsible restraint policy that doesn't just simply look like it's pie in the sky or just get immediately dismissed by US policymakers. And so we're in the process of trying to do that. So, and I'd appreciate any input from you if you ever decide you'd like to make any. Thank you very much, Kevin. I think we've exceeded our time. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. Gone in a lot of different directions. I've learned a lot, and I've learned even more from reading your book. So everybody go out and buy Kevin's book. It's great.
Oh, I'm going to encourage them, Michael, to go and buy 2 books each, because I'm now in the retail business. So.
Okay. Oh, you're in the retail business. Okay, well, I got to tell you here, 2 books each are $32 each. I don't know, Kevin. That's going to be pretty high.
That's a bit steep.
All right.
Get one for your parent and your grandma. There you go.
Oh yeah, that's right. You want your grandma to read it for sure.
Thanks for having me.